July 16, 1945. The desert of Alamogordo, New Mexico, stood still. The air was dry, electric, heavy with something that no one could quite name. Miles of cables stretched across the sand, converging toward a steel tower that held an object both fragile and terrifying, the world's first atomic bomb. They called it the Gadget. Dozens of men stood watching in silence, soldiers, engineers, physicists. Some had escaped Europe's chaos only to build the weapon that might end it. Others didn't yet realize that history was about to divide itself in two, before and after Trinity. The countdown began, soft, deliberate, final. 30 seconds. The wind stopped. The horizon, for a heartbeat, seemed to hold its breath. Then, light. Not like lightning, not like dawn. It was a light that erased shadows, that burned its own reflection into the sky. The shockwave followed seconds later, rolling through the desert like the voice of something ancient awakening. Robert Oppenheimer, standing in the bunker, whispered words from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." In that instant, humanity entered a new era, one born not from war, but from the triumph of intellect unrestrained. A weapon conceived by the sharpest minds of a generation, driven by fear, ambition, and the logic of survival. The Trinity device yielded the power of 21,000 tons of TNT. Yet the true explosion wasn't the one seen in the desert sky. It was the realization that knowledge itself had crossed a boundary. From this moment on, science would no longer serve only curiosity or progress. It would serve power. It began not in the desert, but in the lecture halls of Europe. In the late 1930s, a quiet revolution was taking place in physics. The discovery that matter itself could release unimaginable energy. Einstein's equation, E=mc2, was no longer an abstraction. It was a warning. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, that equation became a matter of national survival. Across Europe, Jewish scientists fled persecution, among them Fermi, Szilard, Teller, and Bethe. They carried with them not weapons, but ideas, the possibility of splitting the atom, of unlocking a chain reaction powerful enough to reshape the world. By 1940, intelligence reports suggested that German physicists were working on a similar project. In Washington, that rumor turned fear into funding. President Roosevelt received a letter, drafted by Albert Einstein and signed by physicist Leo Szilard, urging the United States to act before it was too late. The message was clear. If the Nazis built the bomb first, civilization itself might not survive. Thus began the Manhattan Project, a name chosen to hide its true purpose beneath bureaucracy. It was the most secret, most expensive scientific effort in human history. A network of laboratories, factories, and mines, all synchronized under military command. At its head stood a young theoretical physicist from Berkeley, J. Robert Oppenheimer. Brilliant, eccentric, and tormented by doubt, he was chosen not for his military discipline, but for his ability to see connections between equations, between people, between worlds. As he later recalled, "We knew the world would not be the same." A few people laughed. A few people cried. Most people were silent. By the end of 1942, what had begun as a theoretical equation had turned into an industrial empire, stretching from the laboratories of Los Alamos to the uranium mines of Oak Ridge and the plutonium reactors of Hanford. Science had found its battlefield. They came from every corner of the scientific world: physicists, chemists, metallurgists, mathematicians, and dreamers. Some were Nobel laureates, others barely out of graduate school. All of them were bound by a single mission they could barely comprehend. In early 1943, Los Alamos did not yet exist. It was a barren mesa in northern New Mexico, chosen for its isolation, its silence, and its sky that stretched endlessly over the desert. Within months, under military supervision, a secret city began to rise. Barbed wire encircled it, guards patrolled the gates, and mail was censored. To the outside world, it was simply Project Y. Inside, ideas collided faster than particles in a reactor. Theoretical physicists debated equations that could erase entire cities. Engineers built new tools, machines, and materials that had never been imagined before. Nothing about the project could rely on existing technology, because nothing like it had ever been attempted. At the center of it all was Oppenheimer, the thin man in his hat and pipe, moving between laboratories like a conductor among instruments. He spoke to each scientist in their own language, mathematics to one, philosophy to another. His genius wasn't in solving equations. It was in uniting people around a terrifying purpose. Under his direction worked some of the greatest minds of the century. Enrico Fermi, the quiet builder of the first nuclear reactor beneath a football stadium in Chicago. Niels Bohr, the Danish master who had fled Nazi Europe and became both teacher and conscience to the group. Richard Feynman, young, irreverent, calculating with wild precision on his chalkboards. General Leslie Groves, the military counterpart, pragmatic, imposing, and utterly determined to see results. Together, they designed the impossible. 2 bombs, 2 principles. One fueled by uranium, little boy, the other by plutonium, fat man. But beyond the equations and blueprints, there was something else in the air at Los Alamos. A quiet tension, a shared unease. They were no longer asking if they could build it. The question had become when, and what would happen after. Science, once a language of discovery, was becoming a dialect of destruction. The Manhattan Project wasn't one place. It was an entire nation hidden in plain sight. Across the United States, a network of secret cities, laboratories, and factories began to hum with quiet urgency. Each facility knew only a fraction of the truth. Only a handful of men understood the full design. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a new city appeared almost overnight. 60,000 people lived behind fences, working in shifts around the clock, refining uranium through miles of copper tubing and magnetic separators. They didn't know what they were producing. Most believed it was a new kind of fuel or a medical experiment. Every letter home was censored. Every conversation was watched. In Hanford, Washington, the scale was even greater. Beside the Columbia River, construction teams built massive reactors to breed plutonium, a substance so rare it had never existed in nature before. The reactors glowed faintly at night, humming with invisible radiation that workers barely understood. Entire communities were displaced to make room for this new world. The cost of secrecy was measured not only in dollars but in silence. Every shipment, every truckload of ore, every gram of purified metal was tracked, coded, and disguised. Trains moved through the countryside with sealed cargo, marked by cryptic symbols that only a few in Washington could decipher. Security clearances became a form of identity, a hierarchy of knowledge defined by how much one was allowed to know. Even the scientists at Los Alamos operated under layers of compartmentalization. One team built detonators without knowing what they would ignite. Another refined metals without realizing what they would destroy. Information was divided, filtered, and controlled. General Leslie Groves managed this vast machinery with military precision. To him, time was the most dangerous enemy. Every delay was another day the Germans might get ahead. His mantra was simple. We're not just building a weapon. We're racing the clock. By 1944, more than 130,000 people worked for the Manhattan Project. Most of them unaware they were part of the largest scientific experiment in human history. The total cost would surpass $2 billion, more than the United States had ever spent on any single military endeavor. And yet, despite the secrecy, despite the scale, the machine worked. Ore became gas. Gas became metal. Metal became a weapon. The world's first nuclear arsenal was being forged not in battlefields, but in factories, by workers who didn't know they were changing history. By early 1944, the tide of war in Europe had turned. The Allies were advancing through Italy. The Luftwaffe was faltering, and German scientists, once feared to be ahead, had fallen silent. Rumors suggested that their atomic program had collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. But in the mountains of New Mexico, no one dared to stop. Momentum had become its own master. The Manhattan Project had grown too vast, too secret, and too powerful to pause. For the scientists at Los Alamos, time was no longer just a measurement. It was an obsession. Every calculation, every test, every sleepless night carried the same question. How much longer? Oppenheimer walked the corridors like a man suspended between two worlds, driven by intellect, haunted by consequence. He had once described theoretical physics as a high priesthood of pure thought. Now it had become a ritual of urgency. Pressure came from above, from Washington, where General Groves demanded results. He visited the laboratories with a soldier's impatience. Every delay meant another shipment, another expense, another chance for leaks. Groves trusted Oppenheimer's brilliance, but not his conscience. Meanwhile, the engineers fought a different war. Uranium enrichment at Oak Ridge was painfully slow, and plutonium production at Hanford brought new dangers. The material was unstable, unpredictable, lethal even to touch. Machines corroded, containers leaked, and men fell sick without knowing why. Still, the work continued. By the spring of 1945, a strange paradox had emerged. Germany was collapsing, Hitler near defeat, yet the Manhattan Project was accelerating. Its target had shifted from Europe to the Pacific. The weapon once meant to prevent disaster was now being prepared to end another war entirely. In April, word reached Los Alamos that President Roosevelt had died. His successor, Harry S. Truman, inherited not just a war, but a secret he barely understood. When General Groves briefed him about the bomb, Truman reportedly stood in silence, realizing that he now held a power no leader in history had ever possessed. At Los Alamos, the sense of urgency became absolute. Tests intensified, designs were finalized, and new code words filled the air. Gadget, Trinity, Little Boy, Fat Man. One physicist wrote in his diary, "We are no longer racing against the Germans. We are racing against the future, and in that race there could be no finish line, only impact."
They called it the Gadget, a name so modest it bordered on irony. It was the most complex machine ever built, yet it looked crude, a sphere of dull metal, studded with detonators, wrapped in cables that coiled like veins. It weighed nearly 10,000 pounds, and no one could say for certain what would happen when it ignited. The device was assembled at a remote site in the New Mexican desert known as the Trinity Ground Zero. The location had been chosen for its emptiness, a place where failure could vanish into sand. Even the name Trinity carried layers of meaning, faith, science, and perhaps the unspoken hope for forgiveness. In the weeks leading up to the test, Los Alamos became a storm of preparation. Technicians wired circuits through the night, engineers checked fuses and timing mechanisms, and guards patrolled the perimeter with rifles under the scorching sun. Everything had to be perfect or nothing would remain. The bomb's core, plutonium-shaped with near-molecular precision, arrived under heavy guard from Hanford. It was a metal so unstable that even the scientists handling it could not predict its temperament. They knew only that once the implosion began, a chain reaction would follow in microseconds, too fast for human comprehension, too powerful to stop. As the test date approached, fear began to spread in whispers. Some of the physicists, half in jest and half in terror, calculated the odds that the detonation might ignite the atmosphere. The number, they concluded, was low enough to proceed. Still, the question lingered. What if the sky itself caught fire? On the night of July 15, 1945, a storm rolled across the desert. Lightning flashed over the horizon, grounding planes and delaying the test. Inside the control bunker, men stared at their instruments, waiting for the rain to stop. Coffee grew cold, hands trembled, and the silence stretched toward dawn. Finally, at 5:29 a.m., the countdown began. Oppenheimer stood among them, motionless, his hat pulled low. He would later recall the moment as both triumph and despair, the instant when intellect met its own reflection. The detonation shattered the horizon. A fireball bloomed upward, turning the desert into glass. The shockwave rippled across the earth, followed by a sound so deep it seemed to echo from inside the bones. Colors no human eye had ever seen flooded the sky. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then, as the mushroom cloud rose, someone whispered, "It worked." But in that success lay something unspoken, a realization that they had built not just a weapon, but a new boundary for existence itself. When the dust settled, the sand beneath the blast site had fused into green glass. They called it Trinity. It shimmered in the sunlight like a souvenir from the end of the world. Silence came first, a silence so deep it swallowed the desert. Then, slowly, the echoes returned, a low rumble that rolled through the mountains and faded into the horizon. The men in the bunker stepped outside, shielding their eyes from the rising dust. The sun was already climbing, but the world still glowed faintly, as if dawn itself were uncertain. On the far edge of the valley, a vast column of fire and smoke twisted into the clouds, beautiful, terrible, and alive. No one cheered. There were no shouts, no applause, no celebration, just quiet awe and a creeping realization that something irreversible had happened. Oppenheimer stood motionless. His pipe hung from his hand, forgotten. Witnesses would later say his face was pale, his eyes hollow, as if he had glimpsed the future and found no comfort in it. A few feet away, General Groves was already calculating the next step: logistics, delivery, deployment. To him, the test was proof of success. To Oppenheimer, it was proof of consequence that as the scientists drove back toward Los Alamos, the desert shimmered behind them like a mirage. Their conversations were fragmented, half in numbers, half in disbelief. One of them murmured, "We may be the luckiest men alive, or the most damned." That evening, reports were filed, photographs developed, measurements confirmed. The energy release was greater than expected, equivalent to 21 kilotons of TNT. The data was perfect. The weapon, viable. But amid the precision, something else began to take hold. Silence within each man. Letters written that night were careful, detached, filled with technical jargon that hid the weight of what they had witnessed. They spoke of blast radii, of overpressure, of luminous intensity. None spoke of fear. At Los Alamos, the celebrations were subdued. Some played poker, others drank quietly. A few went out to the edge of the mesa to look toward the desert where the sky had burned. They said nothing. In Washington, word of the successful test traveled fast. President Truman, now in command of a weapon beyond imagination, began to see it as a key to ending the Pacific War, swiftly and decisively. To the military, the bomb was no longer an experiment. It was a tool. To the scientists, it had become something else entirely, a question that could no longer be answered. As the days passed, Oppenheimer began to withdraw. He had fulfilled his mission and lost something in the process. When asked how he felt about the success, he replied simply, "The physicists have known sin," and in that confession lay the beginning of a new age, one in which knowledge would forever carry the shadow of what it could destroy. Washington, D.C., July 1945. The corridors of the White House were quieter than usual. President Harry S. Truman, still new to the office, carried a burden even Roosevelt had never faced. The knowledge of a weapon that could erase a city in seconds. He had learned of the Manhattan Project only after Roosevelt's death. General Leslie Groves had briefed him in blunt terms. "Mr. President, we have built the most terrible weapon in human history. It works." The war in Europe was over, but in the Pacific, Japan showed no sign of surrender. The invasion of the Japanese mainland Operation Downfall was estimated to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. Truman, pragmatic and cautious, was desperate for an alternative. Now, for the first time, he had one. In July, Truman traveled to Potsdam, Germany, to meet with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. There, between negotiations over Europe's reconstruction, he received a coded message: "The baby is born successfully." It was confirmation of the Trinity test. Truman's demeanor changed overnight. Those who met him afterward described a man newly confident, not reckless, but aware that he now held the balance of the world in his hands. The discussions in Washington that followed were not moral, they were strategic. The arguments were clear and cold. A demonstration might fail, emboldening Japan. A prolonged war would drain the nation's will. A sudden, overwhelming strike could force surrender and end the conflict instantly. Scientists like Leo Szilard and Niels Bohr urged restraint, proposing that the bomb be shown to Japan before being used. But the voices of caution were drowned by urgency. The military saw the weapon not as a question, but as an answer. On July 25, Truman approved the final order. The first bomb, Little Boy, would be used against a Japanese city that had not yet been heavily bombed, to measure its true effect. Hiroshima was selected. In his diary, Truman wrote with measured detachment, "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. It may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley, after Noah and his fabulous ark." The decision was made in a room lit by the afternoon sun, with papers stacked neatly on polished wood. There was no shouting, no ceremony, just signatures, initials, and silence. Outside, the summer heat lingered over Washington. Few people walking the streets that day could imagine that. Halfway across the world, a single aircraft was already being prepared to carry the end of an era. Tinian Island, July 31, 1945. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, on a strip of coral turned into an airbase, the final act of the Manhattan Project was being assembled. Under blinding sunlight and strict military secrecy, the bomb called Little Boy was prepared for use. Unlike the complex plutonium device tested at Trinity, Little Boy was simpler in design, a gun-type uranium bomb. Inside its 10-foot-long casing, two subcritical masses of uranium-235 would be fired together by conventional explosives. forming a single supercritical core in less than a millisecond. The result would be an uncontrolled chain reaction, a man-made sun, unleashed in the sky. Technicians worked around the clock inside a heavily guarded hangar known as the assembly building. They handled components with white gloves, consulting blueprints stamped Top Secret Manhattan Engineer District. The mechanics followed orders without asking questions. Few of them knew the device's true power. Nearby, the 509th Composite Group, a unit created specifically for this mission, trained under Colonel Paul Tibbets. Their aircraft, a silver B-29 Superfortress named Enola Gay after Tibbets's mother, had been modified to carry the bomb in a special cradle within its bomb bay. Each detail of the operation was rehearsed: flight paths, fuel calculations, timing, weather reports. Meteorologists studied the Pacific skies, searching for clear conditions over the target city. Every minute mattered. Visibility could determine history. On August 4th, final orders arrived from General Groves and President Truman. The target was confirmed: Hiroshima, a military-industrial center with minimal prior bombing, allowing the full effect to be measured. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian, accompanied by 2 observation planes. Inside the bomb bay rested Little Boy, its uranium core now armed. Captain William Parsons, the weapons ordnance officer, assembled the firing mechanism during flight, a task done by hand. 30,000 feet above the sea, the flight was calm. Tibbets later recalled that it felt like any other mission, except for the weight of silence among the crew. They did not know exactly what they carried, only that it was something that would end the war. At 8:15 a.m., the Enola Gay reached Hiroshima. The city lay quiet below. Morning markets opening, children walking to school, trams gliding through narrow streets. The bomb bay doors opened. Little Boy fell for 43 seconds. It spun gently, guided by fins, until a barometric sensor triggered the detonation at 1,900 feet above the city. A blinding flash, a rising sphere of fire. In that single instant, 70,000 lives vanished. Steel vaporized, stone turned to ash, shadows burned into walls. From the air, the crew saw the cloud climbing higher, turning white, then gray, then black. Tibbets whispered, "My God, what have we done?" No one answered. As the Enola Gay turned for home, the world below was already changing, not just in fire and death, but in meaning. Humanity had crossed the threshold of its own creation. When the light faded, there was no sound, only wind and falling ash. Hiroshima had ceased to exist in less than a heartbeat. The city that once held 300,000 souls had become a wasteland of fire, smoke, and silence. At ground zero, temperatures reached over 4,000 degrees Celsius. Everything combustible burned. Everything living vanished. Human shadows were etched into concrete outlines of people frozen at the moment the flash struck. They would be the only proof they ever existed. Those who survived the initial blast stumbled through the ruins in disbelief. Clothes torn to ribbons, skin burned and hanging, eyes blinded by light. The riverbanks filled with people seeking water that could not cool them. Mothers carried children who no longer breathed. The air itself shimmered with heat and invisible poison. No one yet understood radiation. Doctors and nurses who rushed to help began to collapse within hours, their hair falling out, their skin erupting in lesions. The city had become an open laboratory of suffering. By nightfall, Hiroshima glowed faintly in the dark, not with fire, but with the reflection of an invisible storm. Rain began to fall, black with soot and radioactive dust. Those who drank it soon died. American reconnaissance planes returned the next day, photographing the city from above. What they saw defied comprehension: a single circle of destruction nearly 2 miles wide, where nothing cast a shadow anymore. Truman was informed that the mission had been successful. On August 7th, newspapers across the United States carried the headline, "Atomic Bomb Destroys Hiroshima." The tone was triumphant, the scale unimaginable. Most readers could not grasp what had truly happened. The magnitude was beyond language. In Los Alamos, the scientists read the reports in silence. Some celebrated, convinced the weapon had saved lives by ending the war quickly. Others wept. Oppenheimer walked alone that evening, saying little. He had once believed the bomb would be a deterrent, not an act of vengeance. Now he saw the truth. Once unleashed, there could be no restraint. In Tokyo, the Japanese government struggled to understand what weapon could annihilate an entire city in one strike. Military commanders refused to surrender. They called Hiroshima a new type of bomb, and prepared to fight on, but across the Pacific. A second device was already waiting its name: Fat Man. and the shadow of Hiroshima had only just begun to spread. August 9, 1945. Only 3 days had passed since Hiroshima, yet the world had already changed beyond recognition. Still, in Washington, in Guam, and aboard the B-29 bases of the Pacific, the machinery of war kept moving. The second mission had been authorized. The bomb was codenamed Fat Man. Unlike Little Boy, it was not a simple design. It relied on a complex implosion system, squeezing a plutonium core into critical mass using shaped charges. It was more efficient, more powerful, and infinitely more unpredictable. The target had originally been Kokura, an industrial city, but on that morning, thick clouds and drifting smoke obscured the signs. After 3 failed passes, the crew turned toward the secondary target, Nagasaki. Aboard the B-29 boxcar, Major Charles Sweeney flew through turbulence and uncertainty. Fuel was running low. The bombardier Captain Kermit B. Hahn adjusted the sight, peering through gaps in the clouds. At 11:02 a.m. he saw a break, a clear opening over the Urakami Valley. He released the bomb, that it fell for 43 seconds before detonation, at an altitude of 1,650 feet. The explosion tore through the valley with a blinding pulse, a second sun, blooming above a city built between hills. The blast wave rolled outward, obliterating everything within 2 miles. Steel factories, temples, wooden homes, all dissolved into dust and flame. 75,000 people died almost instantly. Tens of thousands more would follow from burns and radiation. The valley burned for hours, then days. Priests at the Urakami Cathedral, once the heart of Japan's Christian community, vanished in the light. From the air, the boxcar's crew watched in stunned silence. The cloud climbed higher than they had ever seen, mushrooming into the stratosphere. Sweeney later wrote, "We turned, and the city we had seen moments before was gone. It was as if someone had erased it from the earth." Back in Tinian, news of the mission was received with routine efficiency. The military considered it another success. But to the men who had seen the fire firsthand, success no longer had meaning. In Washington, Truman announced the second bombing in the same measured tone as before, "We shall continue to use it until Japan surrenders." Yet, even among the scientists and strategists, doubts began to spread. Was the second bomb necessary? Was one demonstration of power not enough? In Tokyo, the Emperor's Council met in despair. 2 cities erased, 2 warnings unanswered. The ministers debated surrender, but pride still lingered like smoke. Then came another message, not from bombs, but from Moscow. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan. Within hours, the illusion of resistance crumbled. The empire was surrounded by armies, by fire, and by history itself. Tokyo, August 10, 1945. The once mighty empire was falling apart. 2 cities lay in ashes. Communications were collapsing, and reports of radiation sickness, still unnamed, arrived by the hour. In the Imperial Palace, the government convened for an emergency meeting that would decide the fate of a nation. For the first time, Emperor Hirohito sat among his generals and ministers, not as a divine figure, but as a man facing the ruin of his empire. Around him, the debate raged, surrender or annihilation. Many officers insisted Japan must fight to the last soldier. Others, stunned by the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, spoke of futility. Intelligence reports confirmed what few wanted to believe. The Soviets had declared war, invading Manchuria and destroying the last hope of a negotiated peace. Japan was now trapped between the Allies, the Red Army, and a weapon that defied comprehension. That evening the Emperor rose to speak. His voice, calm and deliberate, carried a tone that none in the room had ever heard. He said, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb." No one interrupted. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. Hirohito continued, invoking the survival of the Japanese people as the highest duty. He declared his intention to endure the unendurable, to accept the terms of surrender. The generals bowed their heads. Some wept, others clenched their fists in silence. The meeting ended in stunned quiet. Centuries of tradition had just been overturned, and in the days that followed, a new fear emerged, not of the enemy, but of rebellion. Fanatical officers plotted to prevent the surrender, to seize the emperor's recorded speech before it could be broadcast. They stormed the palace, cutting telephone lines and searching the corridors by torchlight, but the recording hidden inside a basket of laundry by palace servants survived the night. On the morning of August 15, 1945, at noon, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice for the first time. The broadcast crackled over radios across the nation, solemn, distant, yet unmistakably human. We have resolved to pave the way for a great peace for all generations to come. The enemy now possesses a new and terrible weapon. The message was formal, coded, but its meaning was clear. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. In the streets, millions knelt in silence. Some wept openly. Others bowed toward the imperial palace, unsure whether to feel relief or despair. Across the Pacific, in the United States, church bells rang, and crowds flooded the streets in celebration. But beneath the cheers, a quiet unease remained, a sense that victory had come at a cost too great to name. At Los Alamos, the scientists received the news with mixed emotions. The project had achieved its purpose, but the weight of what it had unleashed hung over every conversation. Oppenheimer wrote that evening, in some sort of crude sense which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish. The physicists have known guilt. The world had entered peace, not by triumph, but by surrender to its own creation. The war was over, but for the scientists of the Manhattan Project, there was no peace. In August 1945, as the world celebrated, the men and women who had built the bomb returned to their laboratories and to their conscience. Los Alamos, once a hive of secrecy and urgency, grew eerily quiet. The fences still stood, the guards still patrolled, but the purpose that had once united thousands now dissolved into unease. The project that began as a race against tyranny had ended with cities in ashes. Robert Oppenheimer walked the corridors like a ghost of his former self. He had delivered victory, yet felt none of its satisfaction. When he met President Truman later that year, he confessed, "I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman, irritated, handed him a handkerchief and said, "Well, here, would you like to wipe them off?" The physicist left the White House pale, shaken, and silent. Others wrestled with the same guilt in quieter ways. Enrico Fermi, ever the pragmatist, returned to Chicago to continue research in nuclear physics. He spoke little about the bomb, focusing instead on peaceful uses of atomic energy. Leo Szilard, who had once urged Roosevelt to start the project, now campaigned to control it, drafting petitions to prevent further use of nuclear weapons. And Edward Teller, restless and ambitious, began to dream of something even more powerful, a hydrogen bomb, a superweapon that could make Hiroshima look small. The scientific community divided. Some believed that knowledge must continue, no matter the risk. Others argued that science had crossed a line that should never be crossed again. In September 1945, the U.S. Army formally ended the Manhattan Project. Its facilities were dismantled or transformed. Its secrets passed into the custody of a new entity, the Atomic Energy Commission, created to manage the power that could both light the world and destroy it. But the illusion of control was already fading. Reports from the Soviet Union hinted at espionage, blueprints and equations leaking through invisible cracks. Klaus Fuchs, a British physicist who had worked at Los Alamos, would later confess to passing atomic secrets to Moscow. The balance of terror had begun. For Oppenheimer, the years that followed were filled with lectures, interviews, and regret. He spoke of the physicist's sin, of the moral weight that no equation could erase. In one speech, he said quietly, "In some crude sense, we have known the atomic bomb as a physicist knows sign. And this is a knowledge that will not leave us." The desert that had once glowed with man-made light was now just sand again, cold, empty, and haunted by memory. But for those who had seen the flash, peace would never again mean silence. The atom had been split, so had the soul of science. The atomic age began not with celebration, but with suspicion. By 1946, the glow of victory had already dimmed, replaced by a quiet dread spreading through Washington and Moscow alike. The secret that had ended one war was now fueling the next. In the United States, optimism gave way to anxiety. Politicians spoke of peace through strength, a phrase that soon meant building more bombs, not fewer. Scientists who had once believed they were ending all wars now found themselves designing new ones. The Soviet Union, watching from across the Iron Curtain, refused to remain behind. Joseph Stalin had long known of the Manhattan Project through his network of spies. Blueprints, notes, and formulas smuggled out of Los Alamos had given Soviet physicists a head start. In 1949, just 4 years after Hiroshima, the USSR detonated its first atomic bomb at sea. The world was stunned and terrified in Washington. The response was immediate. The Truman administration launched a new project, the pursuit of the hydrogen bomb, a device 1,000 times more powerful than those dropped on Japan. Edward Teller, once restless in Los Alamos, became its fiercest advocate. He called it the logical next step, Others called it madness. Oppenheimer, now head of the General Advisory Committee to the Atomic Energy Commission, opposed the development. He argued that humanity could not survive an endless race of escalation. But his voice carried less weight in a world ruled by fear. Too many in government. Oppenheimer's moral restraint looked like weakness, even betrayal. The dream of international control over atomic weapons, proposed by scientists like Niels Bohr and Leo Szilard, faded into diplomatic deadlock. Each nation began building its own stockpile, each afraid to be the one left defenseless. The logic was circular but absolute. Deterrence through terror. By the early 1950s, the image of the mushroom cloud had become a symbol of both power and paranoia. Children in American schools practiced duck and cover drills beneath their desks. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards. The language of annihilation had entered everyday life. In laboratories once devoted to curiosity, research turned toward weaponization. Physics was no longer the study of how the universe worked, but how it could end. Oppenheimer watched this transformation with growing despair. He had once said that science should be a search for truth, not dominance. Now, truth itself had become classified. The Cold War had begun, not with armies crossing borders, but with silence between nations, and with the lingering echo of a single explosion in the desert of New Mexico. The light of Trinity had not faded. It had simply moved north, to Moscow, to Washington, to every horizon where power could eclipse reason. By the early 1950s, J. Robert Oppenheimer was no longer the bright, elusive genius of Los Alamos. He was now a national figure, respected, feared, and quietly resented. The father of the atomic bomb had become its most troubled critic. Oppenheimer had argued publicly against the hydrogen bomb, warning that it would lead to a balance of terror. In the atmosphere of McCarthyism and Cold War paranoia, such caution was seen not as wisdom, but as weakness, or worse, disloyalty. Whispers began to circulate through Washington's corridors. Oppenheimer had associated with left-wing intellectuals before the war. His wife, Kitty, had communist ties. His brother Frank had once attended party meetings. What had once been irrelevant now became ammunition. In 1954, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission summoned Oppenheimer to a security hearing, a tribunal that would determine whether he could keep his government clearance. The hearing, held behind closed doors, was less a trial than a public unmaking. For weeks, Oppenheimer faced relentless questioning. Old friends turned into witnesses, letters, conversations, even jokes from decades earlier were dissected and weaponized. General Groves, who had once defended him, was now silent. Edward Teller, his former colleague, testified reluctantly, "I would feel personally more secure if public matters would rest in other hands." Those words sealed Oppenheimer's fate. The verdict, delivered on June 29, 1954, declared him a security risk. His clearance was revoked. He would never again serve the nation whose greatest weapon bore his shadow. When the decision was announced, newspapers called it the fall of Prometheus. The comparison was apt. Like the mythical figure who stole fire from the gods, Oppenheimer had given humanity a power it could not control, and for that he was punished. On the years that followed, he withdrew from public life, retreating to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. There he lectured on philosophy, poetry, and the moral responsibility of science. Students who visited him described a man both magnetic and haunted, brilliant, yet burdened by memory. In 1959, he stood before a gathering of physicists and said softly, "We did the work of our time. We did it as well as we could, but we should have known that knowledge is no guarantee of wisdom." By then, the world had built hundreds of nuclear weapons, enough to end civilization many times over. Oppenheimer had lost his power, but not his voice. He had become something rarer, a conscience in an age of machines. As the Cold War deepened, the light from Trinity seemed farther away, yet its echo remained, not in the desert, but in the eyes of the man who first watched it bloom.
By the time the world entered the 1,960 seconds, the bomb had ceased to be a weapon. It had become a symbol of fear, of power, of the fragile brilliance of human reason. What began as a race for survival had evolved into a philosophy. The image of the mushroom cloud, once secret, was now burned into collective memory, reproduced in art, in film, in nightmares. Children drew it in school. Poets wrote of its silence. Philosophers called it the shadow of modernity. In laboratories and think tanks, scientists spoke no longer of creation, but of control. New treaties were signed: the Partial Test Ban Treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, each an attempt to place moral boundaries on a force born without any. Yet every treaty was also an admission that once knowledge exists, it can never be contained. The bomb had changed more than politics. It had changed perception. Time itself seemed different now, history no longer a series of events, but a single fragile thread suspended over oblivion. Every generation born after 1945 would live beneath that invisible sky. At Princeton, Oppenheimer became a reluctant philosopher. He spoke less of neutrons and equations and more of meaning. The physicists have known sin, he once said, but now he added, and perhaps through that knowledge we can begin to know ourselves. For many of his peers, the bomb had fractured the identity of science. No longer purely a pursuit of truth, it had revealed science as a mirror reflecting both the genius and the hubris of the human mind. The same intellect that split the atom could also split the conscience. Artists, theologians, and writers took up where physicists had fallen silent. They spoke of the atomic sublime, beauty born from terror, awe born from annihilation. Photographs of the Trinity blast hung in galleries as both warning and worship. Humanity had created its own apocalypse and found it strangely beautiful. Meanwhile, the bomb itself evolved smaller, faster, deadlier. By the height of the Cold War, there were over 60,000 nuclear warheads on Earth, enough to turn the planet into dust many times over. The legacy of the Manhattan Project was no longer confined to the desert. It was global, orbiting in missiles and submarines, waiting in silence. And yet, in that silence, a paradox emerged. The very fear of the bomb became the reason it was never used again. The weapon designed to end wars became the one that prevented them. It was, perhaps, the ultimate irony that destruction had taught restraint and that terror had preserved peace. But beneath that uneasy balance still burned the question Oppenheimer could never answer. Did the bomb reveal humanity's power or its limits? The desert is quiet again. The wind moves over the glass sand where the first fire once bloomed. No fences remain, no watchtowers. Only fragments of green stone, the last trace of the moment when humanity rewrote its own destiny. Here, in the silence of Trinity Site, it is difficult to imagine what once happened. The instruments are gone, the tower erased, but the ground still remembers. Every grain of sand carries a memory of light, a light that no sunrise can match. 80 years later, the echoes of that morning still travel through time. They live in satellites orbiting the Earth, in reactors that light cities, in missiles sleeping beneath oceans. The fire that began here never truly went out. It simply changed form. Science had always promised progress, mastery over nature, over ignorance, over fear. But on that July morning in 1945, progress turned inward. The human mind had reached the edge of its own understanding and stepped beyond. Oppenheimer once said that the physicists had become destroyers of worlds. Yet the truth is more complex. They were also builders of machines, of ideas, of the future itself. The tragedy was not that they created the bomb, but that they proved it could be done. The sky above Trinity remains the same vast, endless, indifferent. But the world beneath it is not. We live in the shadow of that first flash, bound forever to the knowledge it revealed. That creation and destruction are twins, born of the same spark. In the end, the story of the Manhattan Project is not a story of war. It is a story of what happens when intelligence outpaces wisdom, when the pursuit of truth forgets to ask why. The physicists who stood in that desert did not just change the world. They changed what it means to be human. And so, as the dust settles once more over New Mexico, the question lingers in the quiet air. Not whether we could do it again, but whether we ever learned how to stop.